Hey, good afternoon. I am Meskaram Gabregzaber, Assistant Clinical Professor and Director of Inclusion and Community Engagement in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. I feel incredibly privileged to be able to provide timely and important programming, such as today's lecture, and want to thank all of you for joining us. Welcome to the spring semester launch and the fourth lecture of our new colloquium series titled Toward a Liberatory Theory and Praxis. This monthly series aims to highlight the work of contemporary scholars belonging to identities and traditions marginalized within mainstream Western academia who, through their work, confront neocolonial power structures and challenge long-standing norms of knowledge production. It was born out of a demand from our graduate students for exposure to more critical scholarship that is relevant to their lived experiences and the times in which we are living. Specifically, I want to thank some of our graduate students, Nalubega Ross, Anais Rogue, Tisa Lowen, and Aliyah Hoff, who worked with me to conceptualize this series and to establish its parameters. I also want to acknowledge SHESC leadership for supporting and sponsoring this series, specifically our unit director, Dr. Chris Stojanowski. Today's talk will be the first of 4 lectures in the series this spring, so please keep an eye out for more information on those upcoming talks as they become available in the coming months and weeks. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Please note that this presentation and the Q&A session to follow will be recorded. However, you, the audience, will not be visible in the recording and all of the mics will be off. As I mentioned, we will be leaving time for questions after the talk, and we're asking that you write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be helping our guest speaker keep track of the questions and select which ones he will answer. So if you would like to ask the question yourself, rather than have me read it out, please write ask live in parentheses after the question when you submit it using the Q&A button, and I will go ahead and unmute your mic so you can ask the question. All right, so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Charles H.F. Davis III. Dr. Davis is a third-generation educator and creative committed to the lives, love, and liberation of everyday Black people. Named a 2020 Emerging Scholar by Diverse Issues in Higher Education, Dr. Davis is currently an assistant professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the University of Michigan, where his research and teaching broadly focus on issues of race, racism, and resistance in education and society. He has produced more than 36 publications, including research articles, books, and scholarly essays, as well as several short and feature-length films. As a creative, Dr. Davis uses photography and film to explore the materiality of Black culture and the socio-political lives of everyday Black people in the United States and abroad. His work has been featured in, but not limited to, the Los Angeles Times, Bloomberg News, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and cited in amicus briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States. In addition to his scholarship, Dr. Davis spent his early career as an organizational strategist, helping launch 2 national research centers at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Southern California. As a racial equity educator, Dr. Davis has trained more than 7,000 students, educators, and institutional leaders from over 100 colleges and universities in the United States and abroad. Most notably, Dr. Davis has given invited lectures at Brown University, Grambling State University, the Sorbonne University in Paris, Stanford University, and the Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a 2-time graduate of the Florida State University, where he earned his bachelor's degree in English and a master's degree in integrated marketing communications. Dr. Davis also holds a master's degree from the Penn Graduate School of Education and a doctorate from the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. As an organizer, he is the founder and director for the Scholars for Black Lives Collective, an international group of grassroots and university thinkers who are politically committed to the labor of engaged scholarship, public teaching, and advocacy against injustice to the end of improving the material conditions of everyday Black people. He currently resides in Ann Arbor with his wife, Brooke, and their daughter, Freedom. Dr. Davis considers Black Lives Matter Los Angeles and the Dream Defenders his primary political homes. His lecture today is titled Engaging Contradictions, Activist Scholarship, and Transforming Higher Education for the Black Public Good. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. Charles H.F. Davis III.
Good afternoon, Arizona State University. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to talk a bit about activist scholarship and transforming higher education for the Black public good. I would first like to take the time to thank Dr. Gabriel Xavier for wonderfully introducing me, but also for the invitation to this particular occasion. It's my first of the year, and I'm very excited to be here with you, albeit virtually, to engage in this conversation. So first, I would like to publicly recognize the lands from which this address is being delivered. I am joining you from the traditional homelands of Anishinaabe peoples, originally inhabited by the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi nations. Lands that were forced to relinquish through the 1817 treaty at the foot of the rapids in exchange for access to the education that the University of Michigan might one day provide. I also ask that in recognition of this land, we seriously consider its repatriation, a future in which we relinquish it back to its original inhabitants for further restoration, preservation, and caretaking. I'd also like to just take a moment of personal privilege to recognize a dear friend, a fraternity brother, a colleague, who many of us lost this past week, Dr. Andrew H. Nichols, who was previously the Senior Director for Higher Education Research at the Ed Trust. Drew was an amazing individual for all of us who knew him, and I think so much about him every time that I do this work, in part because he was very much like a big brother coming into higher education and really put me on a lot of game, as we say, about how these things worked, how these institutions functioned, and really what might be the limits of the things that I'll be talking about today. So I just want to raise up Drew and his memory and his work. So not to belabor the point, but to get just sort of right into it. So today I'll be talking quite a bit about my individual journey and how I sort of arrived at this particular station in my life, but also about how it informed the work and also the work that it ended up producing. And so I want to think about this within the context of it being a journey toward becoming an activist scholar, really thinking about that less of a static space, but ones that we're often constantly re-articulating, reimagining, trying to find ourselves in. And so with that journey, and thinking about this as a picture of my parents there and my chair, Dr. Gary Rhodes, who's a professor at the University of Arizona, where I received my doctorate. So of course I have to start where it all began. 1984 is when I was born in San Antonio, Texas. My father was is a military veteran, and he was stationed there at the time, and my mother was also there. And so much about who I am now in reflection, having just become a parent myself, I think about that maturation, that training, and that development, and some of those formative years that really supplanted for me the importance of speaking up and speaking out. When I think about my father's legacy, someone who was born in Greensboro, Alabama, and grew up in Tuskegee during the height of the civil rights movement, I know that that is very much a legacy that he had to live on a day-to-day, where for many of us for whom it is still a choice, it was not a choice at that time. And so I think very consistently of who I am, but also to whom I belong, to the legacy, the ancestors to which I belong, and how that deeply informs my political praxis, both as an educator, as mentioned in my bio. I'm a third generation educator. My mother was a school teacher and a guidance counselor for more than 25 years, my grandmother being a librarian for 30 years as well. And so again, thinking that this is about a longer trajectory, a longer intellectual and practical tradition of which I am a part. Fast forwarding a bit, as was discussed, I went to Florida State University as an undergraduate. I pursued many bachelor's degrees, if you will, and finally landed in the English department sometime around my junior year. And through that process of those earlier years, I did two main things that were very much informative to, I think, much of my politics today, although I didn't think about it quite so much at the time when I joined the drumline at Florida State and became a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. And when I think back in relationship to how I conceptualize issues of gender, so much of those specific years and the way that gender is constructed for men generally, but Black men specifically within the college context, within fraternity and sorority life, so much of that is deeply, I think, affecting many of the conversations that I would have later, particularly with my good friend Keon McGuire when we were at the Penn Graduate School of Education and many others, who pushed us to think more expansively about our conceptualizations of gender, how masculinity played into not just our everyday ways of life, but how it played and informed our work. Moving about 10 years later, I then arrived at the University of Arizona, just down the street in Tucson, I guess about 90 miles from where you are in Tempe. And in 2012, if we all remember, on February 26th specifically, Trayvon Martin was gunned down and murdered by George Zimmerman. And we know that Trayvon was a 17-year-old Black boy visiting from Miami Gardens to his father's house there. And in the process of beginning to watch the All-Star game, he decided to go to the convenience store to get an Arizona iced tea and a bag of Skittles. And on his way back home, he was racially profiled, stalked, and killed by George Zimmerman, who was a citizen vigilante and self-appointed night watchman for that particular neighborhood. And so if I can think about a particular time in which I turned myself towards really asking the question of what am I doing this work for, right? What is the point? Where am I going? Where are my political bends? That this might be a singular moment that I might think about how being a scholar had to be deeply intertwined with the concerns and issues that were affecting everyday people. To be sure, this was not my original topic. It was work that I was doing kind of adjacent, and Gary pulled me aside, himself a sociologist who had studied unionization, who had studied labor issues, and said, you know, Charles, maybe you should be thinking about studying activism. You're spending all your time organizing students at African American Student Affairs here. You're doing this other work over the summer with scholarship, doing community engaged work. Maybe this is the thing that you should spend your time studying. And so pivoting, you know, from my original work, which is going to be focused on issues of gender and sexuality and historically Black same-sex institutions, it seemed like this might be a specific fit. Again, this is where my energy and time were already going. I was thinking perhaps in many ways that were aligning itself, but really what pushed me right in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin was a group of people with whom I had organized previously when I was an undergrad, and those folks were known as the Dream Defenders. And so thinking about all of what had happened in that particular year, I initiated what I guess would be my first scholar activist project, if you will, in the Activist Millennials Project, which really incubated my dissertation. And so to provide a bit of a summary that I'm going to turn again to some help from multimedia.
I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Come on, everybody, let's all get down.
and an iced tea. Walked out the store and felt the chill of the night breeze. It seemed a little colder than before. He didn't know it was a bore, like a soldier in a war that was watching him, clocking him, thinking about stopping him. 9 milli cocking him. Who's this walking through my neighborhood? He fits all the specifics of criminal statistics. He looks suspicious. 911, what's your emergency? A black man's walking through my hood purposely. Stay calm, it's just no Trayvon, but he wanna be the hero, so he put his cape on. George Zimmerman, neighborhood block captain, loaded Glock strapped in, fake cop has been. Got out the car, ignoring what the cops asked him. They always get away, this time that will not happen.
Come on, everybody, let's all get down.
So that particular piece of media was actually used in a fundraising campaign. And so for graduate students who have been in similar experiences, I didn't quite have all the funding I needed in order to undertake this study. And as I would talk about in a little bit about the importance of having a relationship and being in community when we're conducting these types of studies and doing this type of work, really it was through the efforts of many folks within that particular community who thought it not robbery to chip in. And I was able actually to crowdfund what I needed to do to complete this field study. And so this actually ended up being a multi-sited ethnography, which I did for my dissertation. And it was across the various locations, which are mentioned in the video, but also represented here across the state of Florida. The Dream Defenders work at the time was really based in a campus-based model, which is now shifted to a city-based model. But I wanted to think about how student organizing in a contemporary fashion, particularly in relationship to how they use and engage with media, was happening across these various sites of interest and possibility and across the social movement organization. And so what you have here is what I call a visual field note from a time in Tallahassee, Florida. We were outside of a restaurant. We were actually just packing up to take a trip to Valdosta, Georgia, which some may remember was the home of Kendrick Johnson, who was killed at Valdosta in Lowndes County High School, which is another case that, again, goes along this long tradition of citizen vigilantism and anti-Black violence. And so this project really fortified me. And part of what I'll talk about to some extent is how much of this work is not just about studying activism or thinking about activism itself as a topic, but what it means to engage in a process and in a set of relationships that fundamentally will transform the scholar in terms of what their aims and purposes are, to whom they feel like they are answerable, and ultimately what scholarly production may look like outside and beyond the academy. So first, to define the scholar. Of course, we know as academicians that these terms have meaning, and of course those meanings can be rearticulated. But in thinking about this work, it was helpful to turn toward the scholarship and foundationally thinking about sociology, which has been much of the work around social movements has emanated. And so talking through what we consider for boundaries of intellectual thought and knowledge production as scholars will be a part of my discussion today. So first, turning to D'Antoni, who writes, "The scholar is one who seeks to pursue knowledge, to systematize and possibly to share knowledge with others in a disinterested way. The scholar may be, perhaps must be, aware that the knowledge can be translated into practical uses. But a scholar, he is concerned only with pursuing, acquiring, systematizing, and sharing that knowledge about something. The first point I would make then is that the very act of sharing knowledge draws the scholar into close affinity with activism, because knowledge is and can and will be for something. So this is a particularly important quote in thinking about the notion of the scholar. One, at the time of this particular scholarship, but continuing today, is this notion of being able to be objective or apolitical, as if all research in and of itself is not for or against something. And so this to be sort of a space that allows us to situate the notion of what a scholar may be, but then to push beyond that and to think about what the scholar is also as a subject. And so turning to Greenwood, thinking about this notion of how academia thinks about scholars and what they should be doing and obligating their time to. And so Greenwood writes, Tayloristic academic institutional management structures basically make the necessarily multidisciplinary work of activist scholars impossible by organizing daily life, work life, in a way that ties academics to their campuses. And so we might think about the various limitations placed upon various faculty, particular junior faculty, and the extent to which so much of our place-based work as scholars is relegated to what happens formally inside of the boundaries of institutions, perhaps professional associations, and other things that are considered recognized as scholarly activities. But certainly, when we think about the work of scholar activists, again, being in right relationship, being in community, that takes us off and away from campus. So then what might we make of the activists? And so in defining the activist, thinking about building power and exerting influence for transformative change. Back to D'Antoni, who writes, an activist is an individual who is interested in seeing that his ideological orientation toward the affairs of the world has influence upon those affairs, either to see that the status quo is maintained or that changes are brought about in the system, or even that that system is changed. In a narrow sense, he is consciously aware of his ideological commitments and of their action implications, and he moves in some way toward the achievement of his objectives. And so thinking about this particular perspective, I want to push back slightly to D'Antoni's point, again, thinking about the historical context within which this is written, to some extent, the way that activism has been broadly conceptualized to mean everything and nothing simultaneously. We might think back to what happened on January 6th when the riots and the failed insurrection, the coup by white nationalists happened on the Capitol, and the extent to which some on the right would consider that a form of activism. But to break again from this particular mold is to think about activism as something that inherently must be counter-hegemonic. It must be something that works against the very forces that seek to oppress so many of us in our day-to-day lives. And so thinking about that in this particular context makes me think about the power and also the responsibility that we hold in using our particular skill set to do what I will talk about in a bit as far as counter-hegemonic knowledge production. And so just to give us a sense of that power, to give us a sense of grounding ourselves within a particular ethnographic site in which power is discussed in a unique and important way, again, I will turn to the Dream Defenders and some of my field work.
Hey. Yes! Asha, you got something? Hey. Okay.
I'm just gonna speak from my heart.
Okay, yes.
I want to ask a question. Do you know that you are powerful? Do you know that you are capable of changing the world by changing yourself? I want to ask you today, do you know that you are powerful? That everything you do in your life affects somebody else? That from the moment you wake up in the morning and what you tell yourself about yourself, to the moment you go to bed at night and what you tell yourself about the world, that you are powerful. That you have the capacity to change other people. So be mindful of your actions. Be mindful of how you speak of others when they're not around. Because it will reflect who you are as everyone sees you around. I just want to know tonight, do you know that you're powerful? That you have the power to affect me and therefore I affect you. Hey, that's all I hope we come away with tonight. That no matter what you do, whether you sing a song, whether you write a poem, whether you march on the front lines or you behind the lines, wherever you are in this movement, do you know that you are powerful? That you are necessary? That you are imperative? That I cannot be free without you? That I do not see freedom without you? You are in my dream of myself when I am dreaming. I love you. I love you more than I've ever loved anybody in my entire life. When I see you, I see my children. When I see you, I see my children's children. I see civilizations we never even thought of. I see things we never even imagined was possible. Do you know you're powerful? Y'all, we could do this. We could really, really do this. Fuck all the other shit, we could do this.
Hearing there the words of poet, author, organizer Aja Monet, who spent much of her time in recent years with the Dream Defenders down in Florida, thinking about the relationship between power and love. And so much about activist scholarship, being and becoming an activist scholar, is about negotiating these relationships between power and love. And so what does it mean to be engaged in research in a way that leads to a form of counter-hegemonic knowledge production? Well, turning to the work of Charles Hale, and to those in an important edited volume that guided a lot of my thinking about this issue, looking at Craig Calhoun's forward, I'll read some brief excerpts here to kind of situate us and ground us. As Calhoun notes, Hale notes, scholar activism is not just a matter of publicity or reaching broader publics with a message from social science. It is a way of doing social science, often in collaboration with non-social scientists. Giving social science more public importance is a matter of choosing important problems for research, not simply finding knowledge more effective, simply finding knowledge more effective means of communicating existing disciplinary knowledge, good though that may be. And so as Calhoun points to us in this particular direction, we often think about this notion of activist scholarship inherently being that which is public scholarship, and that there might not be a distinction between the two. But thinking more specifically about this, it's not simply about notoriety or publicity or recognition, but in fact that we are thinking about research as a tool by which we can help answer and respond to some of the most intractable problems in society. And so as we consider the role of social science in this particular endeavor, we have to know that this must extend beyond the boundaries of the academy, beyond our own specific thinking or disciplinary problems, right? And I, as much as anybody else, enjoy nerding out on occasion about sort of the insular nature of the things that we study in our respective fields and disciplines. But to actually engage in this work means we have to have some sort of notion of what the consequences may be in order for us to do that. And so I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the projects that align a bit with this tradition for myself thus far in my career. Continuing from Calhoun, activist scholarship is a matter of critique, not just advocacy. It is part of a project of producing new knowledge, of interrogating more abstract and universal sorts of knowledge with more concrete and particular sorts of knowledge, and of keeping action and its possibilities at the center of attention. The primary purpose of activist scholarship then, thus, may be to address public issues or to help specific constituencies, right? So thinking about this role of scholarship to actually lodge critique, not just against other scholarship, but actually against the very things that are creating these systems, these climates and conditions in which injustice takes place and happens. And so being able to address a public issue, yes, but also being able to help and engage with public constituencies becomes critically important in thinking about this work. So again, with whom are we in relationship? With what communities are we building? And how does our scholarship amplify and support that work rather than often taking the center stage? So this manifestation for us was through a piece that was published in the Review of Higher Education entitled, "What is it Activist? Interpretive Criteria for Activist Scholarship in Higher Education." And so we thought about what it meant to do work in the particular area in which we find ourselves is may be familiar to many of you today on the call. When we think about this Black Lives Matter moment and the extent to which some scholars have taken upon themselves to entitle presentations and or papers or build new research agendas around this particular moment, but have yet to do so in ways that actually think about it as a form of engaged scholarship rather than something that limitedly happens in the ivory tower. And so when we talk about activist scholarship in this particular piece, one, we do offer a set of interpretive criteria that give us a beginning point rather than an end point, one that we hope scholars will engage and continue to expound on. But our concept of activist scholarship broadly refers to counter-hegemonic knowledge production. Again, thinking about the role of the scholar as one who is producing knowledge, but also a particular form of knowledge in a particular context. And so in thinking about that, which we further define as scholarship that explicitly confronts, challenges, and critiques hegemonic epistemologies, practices, research paradigms, and worldviews. Again, thinking about the notion that scholarship in and of itself is automatically for or against something, and being explicit in that intention being one of those criteria. Continuing on, that scholarship failing to challenge what Laurie Patton Davis calls the ordinary, predictable, and taken for granted ways higher education functions as a stronghold of oppressive forces, for example, racism, white supremacy, like Jalil Bishop's work, which are indeed troublesome, is ultimately a reproduction of hegemonic knowledge. And so there's going to be some tension here, right? And part of this is that as junior faculty in particular, that we are often socialized and conditioned in a way that says certain knowledge is going to be valuable and certain knowledge will have a particular set of consequences that would be favorable amongst one's career. So returning back to Hale, we think about this particular tension of one wanting to take up work that we feel is important, work that is consequential, work that is attached and then important in relationship communities. What does Hale have to say? Well, Hale sort of argues about this particular point that often graduate students and junior faculty are regularly warned against putting scholarship in service of struggles for social justice, primarily on the grounds that, however worthy, such a combination deprives the work complexity, compromises its methodological rigor, and for these reasons, puts career advancements at risk. And so just thinking of the many things that I've been told throughout my career, and many, I'm sure, folks who are in this room might be who have engaged or thinking about engaging in this work is, this question of whether it's just me search. Is it too navel-gazing and too narrow and too focused? As if the existing fields and bodies of literature that we see from a white, cisgendered, cis heteropatriarchal perspective in and of themselves aren't also equally narrow, but yet are supposed to have broad applicability to the life world around it. The top journals won't publish that. Do you want to be an activist? or a scholar. You're too close to your research to be objective. You know, activism won't get you tenure, right? You should be less controversial in your early career. And all of these are statements that one has to consider and reconcile the tensions with what they might have in terms of their professional aspirations. But in thinking about this in the context broadly of intellectuals per se, right? Thinking about public intellectualism and scholar activism being very much related and similar is really also to the notion of what kind of intellectuals do we want to be? Do we want to be, as Bourdieu and Foucault talked about, general intellectuals or specific intellectuals, right? Do we think about this level of professional ego ascribed to certain types of work that may be elevated, but often position scholars in positions of ascribed authority and the right to claim and speak authoritatively about subjects that are beyond their boundaries and specialization? The latter, thinking about specific intellectuals, however, would be more modestly, but also more rigorously claim an authority of research and the scholarly debate and testing of research findings to speak on those subjects about which they have real expertise, right? And so again, thinking about this particular subjectivity, this position as one that has to reconcile this tension of what type of scholars do we want to be, what type of intellectuals do we want to be, what tradition are we finding ourselves in? And more importantly, what are we willing to risk and relinquish along that particular path? Turning to James and Gordon, that our work with marginalized communities as a destination point for our intellectual and political selves requires that we connect to radical collectives embedded in communities struggling for social justice. Leaving the academy and embedding ourselves in collectivities, we act beyond conventional society. This is a hallmark of the radical subject, a sign that distinguishes them from the activist scholar. So again, when we think about the way that identity is constructed, both in terms of how we see ourselves, but also how the world sees us, and it's to which one might identify themselves or even be identified as an activist scholar, does not inherently mean that they might see themselves or be seen as radical subjects. But then thinking about the radical subject and creating some distinction rather than semantics, that the radical subject, as James and Gordon continue, is not inherently a revolutionary subject, given his refusal to accept the losses from non-participation in repressive institutions. And so as we think about engaging those contradictions, what does it mean to do this work, to think in these particular ways and yet be housed in places in many ways that are laying on the foundation of racial colonialism and the dispossession of lands from indigenous peoples? What does it mean to work and receive pay for the work that we do in a place that often does not affirm or reaffirm rather our own identities and our perspectives in the ways that it continues to marginalize us and pushes us away from the center? And then what does it mean more especially to be invested in those practices and ways to say, I'm not willing to take risks in order to advance the cause, in order to be in proper community with this constituency of people? And then also what happens when we do engage in these exercises? Well, for me, this resulted in a number of things, but more pointedly during my time at USC, a piece that I will talk about in a second, made it to the popular press. And what is not lost on any of us in this particular moment is how the white supremacist media enterprise often will take what it finds itself to be a soundbite, craft a narrative around it, deploy it, and to ensure that all people who feel similarly might attack that person. And so in my time at USC, actually my first semester there, I came under a national level, I think, campaign and attack, calling for my job based on some comments that were made primarily in a piece, but also made on Twitter. And so we also think about Twitter being a public square, a public arena in which we can engage and debate ideas in a variety of ways, but also has consequences when those are taken up, misconstrued, and misrepresented. And so in this particular case, we have from, I believe it was the Campus Reformer, somebody didn't write that, might have been Breitbart, but it says USC professor calls for a Holocaust against white people. And so while we don't have the space and time to get into all the reasons why calling it a Holocaust is problematic and factually inaccurate, we might think about what it means to speak emphatically and declaratively about white supremacy and the ways that it enacts violence on us in so many different ways, both inside the academy and outside the academy. But then what that means to actually call, as I did in that particular moment, for whiteness as an ideological construct, as a hegemonic force and a way of embodiment to fundamentally be destroyed. When I think about that, in addition, it's also, again, going back to the professional ego, and to the right, you have a graphic here that is both funny and disconcerting, but I did an interview when I was doing a string of interviews around this particular piece that I wrote. And again, the professional ego not actually being something that was in my best advantage, accepted an interview that I didn't properly vet, and I end up in a situation where I'm having a conversation with this particular gentleman. His name is Jesse Lee Peterson, who is at best a provocateur, but someone who really brought me in to have a debate that wasn't a debate. And as we think about our roles as scholars, the extent to which we might forward our thinking, again, steeped and grounded in research, but also situated in analysis. And that analysis and opinions are fundamentally different things. And it's not our job necessarily to engage the thought of opinion in this particular forum with thoughtful analysis. And we see this all the time, right? We see that people of color with doctorates or with terminal degrees are often asked to be in media presentations and to debate someone with otherwise just a controversial opinion. And so what does it mean to take a step back and to say, this actually is not my work, right? This is not something that will fundamentally be a benefit to the issues that I'm concerned about, nor to the people that I want to be in community with. And so drawing forward to think about projects in this particular manifestation, one thing that happened during this particular time is the University of Wisconsin System Board of Regents approved a protest punishment policy. And so we become a bit familiar from cases in Mizzou and other places of both institutions and state legislatures who had a desire and continue to have a desire to punish student protesters, either by saying that their actions will ultimately yield to a possible suspension or an expulsion from their institution. And so what we know about student organizers based on recent data coming out of UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute is overwhelmingly those who are likely to and have participated in protests typically tend to be marginalized students. We know that students of color are more than likely than their white peers to engage in forms of protest and student activism, but Black students particularly are twice as likely. And so to me, when I think about or thought about at the time, what protest policies were actually doing is that they seem to be reinforcing institutionalized white supremacy. Right, and we have all the conversation about free speech, both on campus and beyond. We know that that doesn't necessarily apply because the questions still remain of who is free, who gets to speak, and who will be protected. And so this piece was a piece I wrote for Inside Higher Ed, again, wanting to just make plain what was actually taking place here, to illuminate as best as possible the way that racism is codified by policy. And then that led into some additional work, wanting to think more empirically about that beyond a conceptual analysis. And so working with, then at the time, while I was still at USC with University of Michigan, where I am now, the National Center for Institutional Diversity, had a pop-up grant that I was able to apply for. And a shout out again to Dr. Kiam McGuire, who actually sent it to me a couple of days before Zoom and said, hey, I think your work might align with this. And so I applied and was able to get that granted and produce what also ended up being this paper of Suppressing Campus Protests and Political Engagement in US Higher Education. And so this article was a very short pilot study that actually was conducted at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the context within which these policies were about to take place, and was really thinking about the language that was used, not just at UW-Madison, but within and across the system, as well as the language that would be taken up by the Board of Regents and ultimately the state legislature to say, well, what is the relationship between policymaking mechanisms and governance structures that ultimately provides a deeply repressive structure in which students have no level of recourse? And so yielding out of this was a preliminary framework for thinking about what we call the nested context or protest policy reception. And that work building off of an earlier specific model of nested context of reception that looked at the role of immigration policy and how it had an impact on undocumented DACA recipient students in a variety of contexts at the federal, state, and campus-based levels. So emerging also from that particular space of thinking about how I might do more, right? How I might think about at an organizational level, what it meant to engage in this work and to do so in a community of other people. Certainly I was not the only person thinking about these types of things, asking these types of questions. And what we had seen over earlier years within the Black Lives Matter movement were a number of adjacent organizations with similar calls. And so we have the Law for Black Lives organization, which is really thinking about movement lawyering and those lawyers that are engaged in various support capacities when folks are engaging in direct action, those who have to take up questions as it relates to matters of policy and the law. White Coats for Black Lives, it looks at the role of medicine and public health in the everyday experiences of Black people. And for me, there was not yet a space in which for us to engage in similar practices, but more specifically, the four-prong approach that we are looking at Scholars for Black Lives, being engaged scholarship, as I've already talked about through the activist scholarship lens, public teaching, digital archiving, and advocacy. And so it's just a brief overview of some of that work, thinking about our advocacy work. Two colleagues who I've been engaged with over some number of years, Dr. Mark Lamont Hill and Dr. Molina Abdullah, who's at Cal State LA, and also is co-founder of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, one of my political homes. Both had very different circumstances, but nonetheless were coming under a level of repression by the state. Dr. Hill, when he made his comments at the United Nations with regard to advocating for the rights of Palestinian people, that ultimately, as you would imagine in academia, caused quite a stir and concern that the Board of Trustees, a chairman of which had made some inflammatory comments, were seeking to also have his job and removed for him. And so what could we do to then galvanize a number of folks, both domestically and internationally, in support to create a petition that we ultimately sent to the Board of Trustees under the case being reviewed. In the middle here, you have a forthcoming public education or public teaching project that actually is going to be done in partnership with the Black Lives Matter Global Network, where we are curating a set of Black History Month facts that will go a bit deeper than typically we see. And we've actually enlisted a number of different scholars to write the captions and do some brief work on those particular issues as we go throughout the month. Here you see a picture of Frederick Douglass, one of whom for which the start of Negro History Week by Carter G. Woodson's birthday was built around. Additionally, thinking about digital archiving, some of the shots both from my work and the broader work around the movement, and just taking stock of all that's happening. So much when we think about activism and we think about the civil rights movement, the golden era of student protest, and we think about the photos and the videos that often are used to recall or help remember or to introduce for the first time for younger generations what was taking place in this moment. This is very much how we see ourselves in that particular work, is wanting to document all of what has been taking place across the country and not just in specific locations that otherwise get a bit more notoriety than others. And so the more seminal project at this particular point for Scholars for Black Lives, if you go to our website, what you'll see on the homepage is this page right here. And in the wake of what took place over this summer, specifically when we saw the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd being killed, and also the result of that work within the context of what's happening in Minneapolis and specifically at the University of Minnesota, coming together yet again was an intractable problem with something that actually was also manifesting itself on campus, and yet very little work at the time had been done to talk about and to address those concerns. And so we thought it important to then again bring together a variety of scholars, both in terms of those that were in faculty positions, those were community-based scholars, graduate students, and others, to make a national call to action for the divestment and abolition of policing on campus. And so similarly, we put together a petition, which we actually had over 1,000 people sign in support of, and actually we're starting to gather a number of initiatives that are happening at the local level across a variety of different campuses. But then what does it mean to take this advocacy and also transform it into a research agenda? Well, for me, the starting point ended up becoming going back to the op-ed space. So I had the opportunity to write a few different op-eds, again, back in the inside higher ed with a graduate student, Jude Dizon, who's at the University of Southern California, who actually has a report for higher education leaders who need to be thinking about how to deal with the issues of injustice and policing on their campuses that I implore you to check out. And also, fortunately enough, in the LA Times, who the editor had read our piece in Inside Higher Ed and offered an opportunity to talk specifically about defunding campus police and what that might mean in the Los Angeles context and at the University of Southern California. Building on that work is now thinking about a larger research agenda in which empirical studies can actually happen as well. And so that has taken place both in terms of independent studies that I'm currently teaching this semester, working with two amazing graduate students who are doing some geographic information systems work about police interactions beyond their jurisdictions of campus, but also larger projects that will investigate how money gets spent and the extent to which we are over-investing in the institution of policing, but also using police in ways that are not necessary given the types of things that they typically respond to, which may be underage alcohol drinking citations or mental health episodes, none of which would require an armed or sworn police officer to be the first responder. So what does all this mean within the broader context of having a higher education for the Black public good? Well, first and foremost, thinking about the higher education as the context within which I do most of my work, I have to think constantly about who higher education is for and what are the consequences and impacts of our participation. We're often told that higher education is the foremost pathway for social mobility for those that are low income, first generation, and racially minoritized and other minoritized groups. But as Ernest L. Boyer wrote, that higher education is one of the greatest hopes for intellectual and civic progress in this country. And yet for many Americans, however, it has been seen a part of the problem rather than the solution. And so again, thinking about what are the problems that are emerging to which research could find itself to be useful. And although this had not been my typically, my arena of work, but thinking about, again, wanting to do right and be in support of everyday Black people, knowing that so many more Black folks were struggling with student debt and knowing that it was actually a crisis. And so we've seen that at every step of the way, economically, educationally, that anything that's happening in this country almost always has a disparate impact on Black communities. So this led to a partnership with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in which myself, again, Jalil Mustafa Bishop, and two graduate students who I had at the time at USC, to work on a report entitled Legislation, Policy, and the Black Student Debt Crisis, a status report on college access, equity, and funding in higher education for the Black public good. And what we wanted to take up in this specific report was really a racial analysis of all of what we had been learning about student debt. And so we had seen a number of reports from various organizations, be it the Debt Collective, the American Council on Education, any number of groups who were reporting data And simply acknowledging perhaps at best race as a variable, what it means to actually racialize our understanding of how higher education policy more broadly has had an impact on students, yes, but also on historically Black institutions. So in thinking about the Black public good, we write in this report that a Black public good consists of institutions, of policies, and funding structures that are race conscious rather than race neutral, as well as protections that ensure Black people are included. To be sure, we believe inclusion is not defined by its rhetoric, its predation, or universal appeal, but equity-driven results that improve the educational and material conditions of everyday Black people. To be sure, we believe inclusion is not defined, I'm sorry, that's a repeat. So I probably need to exit out from the slide. And then just to continue, for this to be possible, immediate and critical attention must be given to understanding the current public good of higher education as predatory and racially exclusive, particularly through a network of inequities exacerbated by the race neutral policy, funding structures, and the student loan industrial complex, what we've termed the student loan industrial complex. And so we're at a pivotal moment at this particular juncture where Congress is considering what it will do about the student loan crisis. And although the advocates and many have signed on, we saw a letter come out from the Chronicle earlier today for fully canceling student loans, in part because we understand the implications for one, the economy, given where it is right now, but also the extent to which it can address some areas of disparity for the racial wealth gap as critically important. And so part of this idea of a public good is one, thinking the extent to which a broader public might benefit from that good being made available, or to the extent that it's a private benefit ultimately accrued amongst individuals. And a lot of that discourse, as we talk about in this report, is fundamentally racialized, right? So we think about the conversations around welfare, one to whom actually mostly benefited from welfare, similar to affirmative action, and that we do not frame these things as handouts when they apply to middle-class white folks, but certainly when they apply to folks who have been, again, historically disenfranchised, disempowered from access to opportunity, or saddlebag in this case with student debt from accessing those opportunities, that we consider those things to be fundamental handouts. And so that, to being a racialized discourse, we wanted to elevate and talk to more critically to say if higher education in and of itself must be a public good for Black people, then it must be accessible without consequence to that Black public. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to engage with you and hold some space for us to have an engaged conversation around some questions.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Davis. That was incredibly energizing and hopeful, which is rare, I feel like, in these times. If you want to take a couple of moments just to catch your breath and maybe get some water, we would like to now open up the floor for questions in the audience. As you notice, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you would like to use that option to ask any questions that you might have. And as mentioned earlier, you can put in parentheses, ask live, if you would prefer for me to unmute you so that you may ask it yourself, or otherwise I can ask the question for you. Thank you. As we wait for some of those questions to come in, Charles, I had a couple of things that I noted down as you were talking. And one of the things that struck me, the wording of it, right, is one of those things that you know, but when you hear it vocalized, it makes perfect sense, that activism is inherently anti-hegemonic, or what you talked about as counter-hegemonic knowledge production, I thought was just really well and succinctly put, right? And it kind of pairs with what you were saying a little bit later about the fact that oftentimes we're expected to pair or juxtapose analytical, sort of evidence-based arguments with sort of opinion as if they are one and the same. And to me, that's similar to this sort of everything and anything is activism, or, you know, counts as revolution or protest, right? So I don't know, there's not really a question in there, but more so kind of wanting to flesh that out a little bit, if we could talk a little bit more about that.
Oh, absolutely. I think like any good academic, all questions are actually comments, right? So this is just like being at a conference. So I can appreciate that since we don't have to do that much anymore. Yeah, I think this is just a really important distinction because I would not constitute, and what we talk about in our piece in the review of higher ed, right, is the maintenance of existing power relationships and systems of power inherently cannot be activist, right? It's simply the status quo. And so in my particular perspective, and the perspective of some scholars, right, activism resists that, right? It pushes against that status quo. And so when we sort of create these false equivalencies within the public discourse, right, in part because many of them are framed around opinions rather than thoughtful analysis, rather than grounded in research, right, or even just critical thinking, right, that may be absent of, again, those resources that create a certain form of knowledge, then we end up getting into these circular debates, right, or these debates that otherwise will have folks like ourselves look very, very foolish, right, because we're trying to have a conversation that maybe is at best parallel to the conversations the public or the media enterprise wants to have, right, to sensationalize, to engage in these sound bites. And so I think, in talking about it politically, we also have to, I think, take into account the role the state plays, right, and how the state responds to particular types of activities. And so Derek Purnell had an amazing piece that came out in The Guardian right after January 6th that basically, was amounting to, what if these folks were Black? And this is a lot of our conversation as Black folks as well, right? Like so much of what happened would never have taken place. And we see that based on how the state has responded, whether that's police or the National Guard or what, Trump would weaponize against us, to peaceful protesting in the everyday streets. And so to me, again, when we think about activism and we think about trying to call something like what happened on January 6th such, we have to consider, as Derek talks about, that when Black and brown folks are simply advocating for themselves, right, asserting their right to self-determination and to have their humanity recognized, that we are given the rod of the state. And yet when white folks tend to do it, they're getting the aid and support of the state, right? And so we've seen so much come out about the extent to which people at the Capitol, officers that were in DC police and others sort of worked coercively, right, also with people that were in Congress to allow for these, things to take place and happen in a particular way. And we also know that, as was mentioned, I think a couple of days ago, that the leader of the Proud Boys had been an FBI informant since 2012. And so we see all the ways that the state colludes, again, right, to maintain its status quo and maintain its power, that it does not happen with those who are resisting and fighting for it. And so I wouldn't imagine that if you're aiding and being supported by the state, one could actually call that fundamentally activist, right? Because the risks certainly aren't the same, much less the political ideologies that are informing what we're trying to advance and push forward.
Thank you. So we have a question from Tamika Ferguson. It says, it feels that there is an expectation for Black scholars to take up some of this work that you have discussed as part of the, quote, white supremacy codified within higher education. Could you discuss ways that scholars who may be caught between their personal and professional ambition, disruptive presence at PWIs, and the unspoken yet virtual, i.e. social media pressure to participate in addressing racial strife crisis can work through these expectations, particularly if these expectations can be tied to them reconsidering remaining in the academy?
Yeah, Dr. Ferguson with the question. What's up, Tamika? Appreciate your question. This is a good one. So I think the tension that often exists is really trying to weigh the scales of risk and reward, right? And so much about what it is we do under a system of racial capitalism is about the risk and reward, right? And we know the types of behaviors that are rewarded. We are socialized into them as graduate students. We are even rewarded in some regards with them in parts of our career. And to be completely certain, right? Like I've benefited from many of those rewards in part because perhaps I have, two middle names. I've worked at a fancy white school and I've been in proximity to people who are considered, very good scholars. But I think about, again, that professional ego and the extent to which it makes us make certain types of decisions that I don't always think are on the side of justice. And so a critical point in my development and my coming into whatever my own is at this particular point is realizing the work that I was doing on a day-to-day was coming into so much tension with who I felt I was as a person, but also with sort of my own political positionings and the way that diversity, equity, and inclusion is represented in higher education, right? Like I'm talking about very different things that are not interchangeable, right? Like liberation is incommensurable with diversity in so many regards because representation and otherwise very deeply violent enterprises like higher education, right, ultimately will like co-opt a Black face to put it in a high place to say that we're doing something and do nothing of the neighborhood that it's gentrifying in the process. And so when I think about that, I think we have to put in check, which doesn't mean it goes away, but our desire for some of the reward structures that academia provides. And we talk about this in that piece. That in order to engage in this work, you have to be courageous enough to take those risks that says, I'm going to do work that matters and it means something, even if it doesn't lead to me ultimately getting tenure. But that doesn't mean we necessarily have to abandon that particular exercise. Now, what it creates for us, right, is additional work. which means you've got to write the research article, you've got to write the public report, you've got to do, you know, the documentary film. And for me, I kind of had to accept and do that work or know that work was coming once I decided that this was the type of academic or intellectual that I wanted to be. Because I've kind of always been of the perspective that, yes, I might be, you know, awarded tenure at an institution, but what is that worth if the very people who I attempt to represent in that work, the people with whom I've worked to make that product available, don't respect me, right? And don't think that I'm actually existing in a place that is in right relationship with their aims and purposes politically and doing, as we say, pimping the movement. And so I think we have to really consider seriously of whether those are things that ultimately are to our benefit or to the benefit of our communities, or they are things that are simply put in place to keep us in check so that we don't revolt too much in the institution. They can no longer exploit our genius or our labor. And I think that's really, you know, sort of the question. And then this is why, you know, James and Gordon talk about the need to be willing to let go of those things in pursuit of this endeavor, right? Like if rubber meets the road, and as we talk about this notion of like dismantling higher education and an abolitionist university, we literally have to be committed to being able to do what it is we do as educators, right? And produce what we produce without those resources and not doing so in a venue for which it was necessarily made. We have to be willing to get that up. And part about being in community and being in right relationships, so much of that means that if and when these places are burned to the ground, right, figuratively speaking, we have to go somewhere. And if you have not been in right relationship and in right community, then you will have nowhere ultimately to go. And so I think that that becomes, you know, really important to thinking about how do you navigate that balance, but ultimately, again, thinking about who you are, to whom you belong, and what made it possible for you to do this work in the first place. And I think the last thing that I would say is this pressure to participate is that we all have to make decisions that are appropriate for us, right? We have to know what our capacity is, whether we can engage. And I had to learn very early on, I can't engage in every single issue. One, because I may not be the most knowledgeable, again, thinking about being a specific intellectual rather than a general intellectual, but also that this is exhausting. And so we need to take the time away to, you know, find reprieve, to heal. And we need to be in community so that when one of us takes a step back, another one can take a step up. So David has a question of how I balance activism with the demands of academia and keep myself whole. I mean, it's really hard, to be honest. Again, it's going from, you know, the office hours to a direct action, you know, to home. And part of it is now making also different decisions as a parent, and also obviously in this pandemic that we find ourselves in. Engaging in direct action is a lot different than it used to be. It's also very difficult. And I'm also not necessarily a spring chicken as I was as a young person engaging in this work. So part of it is knowing when it's appropriate to do what specific work, which means, you know, and I struggled through this a lot as I was writing my dissertation. I had taken a job coming out of my field work in part because I was a broke graduate student and I needed that check. But I was literally in my office when Mike Brown got killed in Ferguson. And I was in my office when Freddie Gray had his spine broken in Baltimore. And I thought immediately that I was, you know, this armchair activist sitting in this Ivy League office, not really doing the work. But then I had to think to myself, and I was able to resign and be resolved in that. When I think about all the people we cite and talk about in the movement, right, for better or for worse, but when we talk about, you know, Marxism, and we talk about the work of Angela Davis, and we talk about all these folks, that someone had to sit in their office and write, and someone needed to document and think critically and analyze this particular moment. And that was the work too. So I think that also helps me feel like I'm making a contribution that's important in ways that are appropriate for my skill set, that don't cause as much tension. And then I've also, that I've tried to translate in this talk today, been able to make researchable questions and researchable projects out of things that are directly linked and tied to my activism.
My apologies, my internet dropped, so I'm not sure which questions you've already answered.
So I just answered David's question. I think we've got a couple more in there that I haven't gotten to yet.
Okay. If you want, I can't see the previous questions from before I logged on, so
Sure.
Please feel free.
So we have a question from an attendee that works at a historically white institution or white serving institution. And recently a group of folks got together to discuss the predatory approaches of the institution takes toward recruiting out-of-state Black students. Any ideas on how to approach dismantling this practice? Yeah, this is a real one. So when I was at Arizona, I worked with a group of about 9 young men who, many of whom wanted to be pharmacists. And almost all of them were from California. And they told me that they ended up at the U of A because they got a scholarship. And I'd asked them, I was like, oh, so you got a whole right to get here. They're like, oh no, they offered us like $5,000 a year to come. And I'm thinking like, again, thinking about the student debt crisis, not at the time, but you offered Black kids from out of state who were probably not admitted to one of the UCs, again, thinking about how Prop 209 affected declines in Black enrollment, $5,000 off of, $20,000, $30,000 a year tuition, in part because the prestige of an institution in terms of its name might be better or perceived as better than what might then be available to those students in California. And it was deeply problematic and hugely predatory, and it's a practice that many institutions do with regard to revenue, right? We can think about Gary's work and Sheila Slaughter's work on academic capitalism. But I think part of it, one, is just calling sort of a direct attention to how this particular practice is directly linked to forcing Black people into greater debt, right? And we have so many other practices that also should be talked about with how we recruit, but yet fail to retain and support Black students once they arrive, right? Even sort of beyond and within the context of the financial. And then we have to talk about, well, if you're serious about what you say, in the movement space and in the movement literature, they talk about this notion of what is called the rhetoric of discontinuity, which is basically value incongruence, and that what we say and what we do are very different. So how do we help expose that, right? And make sure that, one, people know, if they don't already, that what you're doing is problematic for these reasons, right? In terms of, again, what it does to those students. And then also this more subversive work, and I can think about our time at Penn, when I was working in admissions and giving tours, and sort of the first semester, giving tours, sort of your typical tour, and then going through a particular process that I won't talk about this specific juncture, when saying like, you know what, I'm just going to keep it a buck with these folks and tell them exactly what Penn is and what it isn't, so that they're at least informed, right, and not sort of gaslit into making a decision that will have huge financial consequences, but also, might incur some level of racial trauma. And so it's also subversively, when you're in these spaces, being able to talk to these students and tell them, hey, look, this is the reality, right, financially, of what's happening, and making sure that we can get access to these folks rather than the institution, circumventing, the people who end up having to support these students to do that work after the fact.
I don't know if there was another question, but there's one here that says, any thoughts on how non-ethnographic, non-social science folks integrate social activism with their scholarly hard science work? What about when those disciplines like primate or conservation abroad have their own important set of ethical issues that may not be as clearly linked to local activist issues?
Yeah, so a few different questions here. So I think one of the things that I learned in doing work with the Dream Defenders, and that ultimately ended up being like an 8-year ethnographic project, was both talking to students at the time and then tracking back with them later longitudinally, how their experience in this group ultimately had an impact on what they decided to do after college. And almost all of the folks with whom I spoke, with some exception, did not plan to be like full-time organizers after they graduated. But what they did share with me is that what they learned in terms of a set of sensibilities, a set of political commitments, would deeply inform them going into, say, the business world and thinking about cooperative economics in a particular kind of way, right? Or going into medicine and wanting to focus in areas that were disparately affecting Black and Brown communities. And so part of what I would say is that there's a certain radical ethic and ethic of love that I think can be attributed to any of the work that we're doing. Again, thinking about what are the problems and who are they affecting, and how what we know in the specialized way can hopefully alleviate some of that stress and some of that trauma. So I think the process is fairly similar, although the application might be a bit different. Let's see.
There was another question that I didn't see from before I dropped, and it's from Rachel Fernandez, and they say, thank you, Dr. Davis, for talking with us today. You mentioned how you were working on digital archiving, and I'm curious if you have worked with or heard of Project Stand, which is centralized hub for academic archives to highlight social justice activities on and off campus. What do you think of these recent efforts by institutions to archive collections revolving around underrepresented communities, and what would you like to see moving forward?
Yeah, great set of questions. So I'm not yet familiar with Project Stand. I'll have to look that up. It's fairly new to me. And so my thinking about the archival process really just stemmed from like deep and prolonged field work and having just my own sort of archive of stuff, but then meeting people along the way who are also doing similar work. And I think about sort of this notion, and I want to talk about this in a very specific context of like an archive for Black lives, at least in this contemporary iteration of what that might look like. And I had a discussion with some other movement photographers and filmmakers, and we talked about like, what if we pulled together resources and created this archive? Because what we found too is many smaller local organizations didn't have the capacity for communications work as some of the larger groups, and didn't have content or assets, as we say, to build some of those things, whether it's their flyers for events or reels from events that they've already had. But one of the things that we discussed, and this was partly through some of their participation in the Annenberg School at USC has a civic media fellowship. One of the things we talked about was the surveillance state. So again, going back to my points earlier, was like, what does it mean to document and archive these particular moments with particular people who may already be or may then come under fire as targets of the state? And we've seen this, right? We see that the FBI either puts out this like all call for like, the citizen to be engaged and to help them find and identify people, or using Facebook or Etsy accounts or any number of things. And what I had to think about, even in my fieldwork, that was actually brought up by some of the organizers, was one, that there's something important about things not always being intelligible, right? And there's certain importance about what organizing means in the day-to-day, that we do things in the dark because we can't afford for them to be revealed in public. And so much of that translated into me holding on to a lot of stuff that never saw the light of day, or it was like sort of this, statute of limitations, if you will, on like when that stuff can actually be released, or an embargo. But I think that's a really critical point about movement documentary work, that sometimes journalists may not be thinking about in that particular way if they're just doing their work on behalf of like a publication. But I think as someone engaged in movement work, doing movement work themselves, having come under fire and scrutiny, we have to think about it in a different way that's politicized, in a way that's fundamentally different. So again, what are we taking pictures of? If the event turns volatile, are we willing to abandon and destroy that archive? If it's not, if it's inherently peaceful and it's literally just documenting those moments, then how do we use that? And to me, it's always about agency. So again, how are we deferential to these communities with whom we're working, that we're documenting, and now actually allowing them to decide how and when things can be used? I think that's like a really, really critical point to that work. And then as far as the efforts by institutions to archive collections, so I've been doing some work with museums recently, which has been really, really interesting because there's a lot of conversation about repatriation of artifacts. And in the university context, I think a lot, because these have been university museums, of the role that they have in preserving legacies of colonialism without having honest conversations about those legacies in and of themselves. We can think about Harvard's initiative to have a conversation about the role slavery played in its development, and they have this very big portrait of a formerly enslaved person named Remy, and it was through a set of portraits that actually an anthropologist at Harvard had taken at the time, of just like documenting Black bodies, perhaps in ways that were familiar to eugenicists, that were just in their personal archives. And again, this commodification of the Black body was like sort of a practice that was undertaken by faculty that were at an institution that are now being used by the institution to promote the thing that says we care about our legacy in relationship to slavery, right? So it's all about these sort of like perverse relationships. And again, I think, where do we create space for agency, for self-determination, to determine the extent to which these things can or should be used, where those archives should be forfeited to the people to whom they belong, and then never used again in ways that are exploitable by the institution. So Mesky, I want to go back to one part of a question that I didn't get to, if that's okay.
Sure, of course.
So there was a secondary question about disciplines like primate or eco-conservation abroad have their own important set of ethical issues that may not be so clearly linked to local activist issues. And so I just want to draw the connection here that one, and this is really important too, is that all organizing is local, right? All activism is local. And this is a piece I didn't talk about, but I think is very important. There's something to be said for, again, those who identify or are identified in this activist scholar tradition, and how there is often a discontinuity between what they write and what they speak about, and how they treat people in their proximity, right? And so for me, when I think about somebody who self-identifies in that regard or suggests they have a particular political orientation, like my question isn't like where you gave your last talk, right? Or what paper you published. It's like, what would the people around you say about how your politics show up in everyday life, right? What would your family say? You say you care about Black women. What do the Black women around you have to say about how you engage with them on a day-to-day basis? And so that is but one example, but thinking about this notion of it being local, that virtually every issue that is on the table has some overlap and intersection. So we think about environmental justice, for example, and the sort of image that is, both generational and cultural, is like, it's like this sort of like white environmental evangelist that's like trying to protect all the trees. Right, where now we're at a point where we know that environmental justice is deeply connected to racial justice, right? We have, the Flint, Michigan case is like but one example, but we think about the resources that are often extracted from our communities, right, have been for centuries, and the land being a place that often, again, we're talking about, land acknowledgement, but not repatriation or like giving the land back. So much of this does have overlap with local communities if we only talk to them about what the implications are of this particular work. There will always be additional and related sets of ethical issues. But again, these things have time, space, and place indicators that mean there are some people who have been affected, and we need to ask those questions of who's being affected by this. When we think about the destruction of an ecosystem, yes, we can and should think about things beyond the anthropocentric sort of perspective, but also like, what does that do to the people who have inhabited those lands for centuries, who have needed those resources? And we saw a lot of that with a lot of the conversation here around pipeline issues and those things being built across sacred indigenous lands. When I think about the fires that happened in California, and I think about and having conversations with Native and indigenous folks from those areas of saying like, yeah, you're not supposed to live there anyway because we know it burns. And that's part of nature's cycle of needing to cleanse. And yet here we have, mostly white capitalists or those who participate in capitalism in a space that they never would have belonged in the first place, continuing to succumbing to the natural disasters that have always been there for centuries.
Okay, we have another question by Angel Velez, and it says, thinking about Chicago's radical activism in the 1960s, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords organization, were the Rainbow Coalition founders to tackle systemic racism. What advice would you provide us around building solidarities within these hegemonic spaces that often try to divide racialized BIPOC scholars?
Yeah, really good question. Shout out to Angel, a really amazing historian who also has written some stuff for one of our recent books. Yeah, I mean, so part of this for me is recognizing that although we may be different, we often share common enemies, right? Or like common oppressors. But also, and this is the thing that also came up in my field work, is thinking about this notion of like a disruption within a disruption. So we often homogenize movements or movement organizations as if there isn't some difference of opinion or what we call diversity of thought within that space, or there aren't other political systems or power systems or relationships that are actually making it really challenging. And so we might think about the shift in terms of discourse and focus on, say, the Black male charismatic leader as like sort of the pinpoint of how movement work should be measured, right? And we know now that we see ourselves led by mostly Black, queer, femme identified folks. And we think of ourselves as a leader full movement rather than one with a specific leader, and those that have risen to certain occasions come under scrutiny for that regard. But I say all that to say is when we talk about building solidarity, one is we think about this in the context of racial solidarity. We must ask ourselves that if we are attempting to build racial solidarity, then what stands in the way of that? And it's not just white supremacy, right? In fact, it is the way that misogyny manifests itself within movement spaces, how homophobia manifests itself in movement spaces. We might liken this akin to certain aspects of certain theological and church traditions, right? Of those people who constantly do the work, never get any of the recognition, and without whom like none of this stuff would be possible. And so I think one, we have to identify what stands in our way of doing the things we want to do that we are in control over, right? Not that like white supremacy is generally. And then secondly, we have to address the various layers and types of racism, particularly anti-Blackness, that happens in non-Black communities of color, right? And this is especially important, something that's been going on with the Association for Hispanics in Higher Education about like where and how do we talk about Latinidad in a way that actually doesn't, or one that recognizes sort of its white supremacist roots, but two, doesn't disenfranchise Black folks who have always existed and lived as Black, right? But also have a particular geographic or linguistic tradition that they are familiar with. And so I think that becomes a root part of it, because when we try to have spaces that are conjoined, these are the things that often make it really, really difficult for us to do the work that we need to do. And we talk about this in the literature through Kimberly Crenshaw's work through the lens of like political intersectionality, right? And the extent to which often constituencies, although they may fall under a particular banner, often have competing aims and purposes, and those ultimately lead to factions within that particular group if they're not able to reconcile or congeal. And we can see this through, what we call on Twitter all the time, like white feminism, right? And it being like clearly for and by white women in ways that didn't account for women of color more generally and Black women specifically. So I think these are all things that have to get addressed at some point if we're thinking about solidarity across racialized, minoritized communities.
Absolutely. If there are any more questions, please put them in the Q&A. I think Dr. Davis has answered everything so far. Just expanding a little bit on that comment, Charles, I think I've been having these conversations lately with a lot of folks, and I think the assumption is that oftentimes we feel like in order to be in solidarity with one another, we kind of can't we have to sanitize our sort of fraught histories and interactions with each other, right? So in order to say that, you know, we can have a coalition between Black and Indigenous folks, we have to sort of sanitize the reality that certain uh, Native American tribes held slaves and sided with the sided with the Confederacy, right? So it's not kind of an all or nothing thing. There needs to be sort of an acknowledgement of that history, in the same way that we expect there to be an acknowledgement of sort of white supremacist institutions sort of recognizing their own historical pasts in order to move forward, and sort of this notion that you're causing division by bringing up those sort of contentious pasts then eventually festers, right? Ultimately in the end.
Yeah, I actually want to jump in on that point. So I
Yeah.
think this particular relationship is one that's really critical for me, at least in this moment, has been for recent years. And I've been having any number of conversations, but one particular conversation with Dr. Amanda Ticini, who's at Arizona State, and thinking about my own relationship to this history, knowing that we definitely have, through a matrilineal perspective, Indigenous folks who are part of our family, and thinking about the Carolinas in particular, and that being part of those quote unquote civilized nations, many of whom owned slaves. But I turned to Eve Tuck's work and attempt to try to reconcile some of these tensions, in part because sometimes within our own space, we get so narrowly focused on anti-Blackness as something exclusive. And this is about marginalization anyway. Reverend Jamie Washington talks about the extent to which people typically operate either out of the pain or anger of their marginalization, but also out of the arrogance of their power and privilege. And so when we are having conversations in Black communities about, you know, this notion of like having our own land and like where are 40 acres, and not questioning whether the United States government could give away 40 acres of something it didn't, you know, own in the first place. And then what does that mean for even our own role in like a neo-settler colonial project, right, as occupiers of this land? Like these are questions we have to ask as well. And so it's not something that only goes in one particular direction, but again, like we are all capable of doing and experiencing harm. And how do we account for the harm that we often do, and address that harm rather than just the harm that we experience, right? I think that's a critical piece that, again, going to the earlier question, but the point you just made, that we have to address and reconcile. And I would say perhaps they're no more important than, say, in the Southwest and in Arizona specifically.
Absolutely. A new question just came in. It says, thank you, Dr. Davis. Earlier you spoke of knowing one's limits, especially if you were a student. What are some of the strategies you found useful to maintain healthy engagement in both scholarship and activism? And have these approaches changed over the years?
Yeah, I mean, so what was told to me, not super early, but early enough in my career, was you have to do your work, right? And like that's just, I think, a really important part, is that we can't dismiss the work that we have to do or mistake the work we're doing for something that it actually isn't, in both cases, right? So like just writing about issues, you know, it's contestable, but like I can't see that as formally being only activist, again, if it's done in isolation and not in community, right? Not so much the act, but like the way we do the act. And so I think part of it is knowing like what work is ahead and what do you have to do. And so as a student, part of that is, you know, what has to happen for your coursework, what has to happen for your preliminary exams and for your dissertation, and really investing in that, because as we see, right, the sort of like neoliberal capitalist society in which we live will always elevate or create a darling out of someone that can ultimately be dethroned, right? Anything that is given to us can be taken away. And I talked about this on Twitter the other day with AERA, had a grad chat. And for me, what I took from this statement that was imparted upon me about doing my work was that regardless of anything else, regardless of what people will say, regardless of their sentiment about what it is you're doing, if you've done your work, then it can stand on its own merits, right? And so for me, it's always taking account for what that work is, and when you have space or when certain work is actually more important, being able to make the decision, exercise your agency to say, at this moment, this is what I need to focus on, which may mean, you know, having the courage to reach out to an advisor and tell them what's been going on, you know, within your own life or things that are important to you, and whether you can have extensions on assignments that may be needed to be due or parts of their research projects that you're working on. But also to really like ask yourself in terms of your future in this particular space and time, is this what you want? Do you want to be at a research one institution, right? That requires of us to, again, sacrifice so much of our humanity and our time and energy in pursuit of things that are not really about us, but about managing and growing the institution? Or do I need to be somewhere else doing what it is, you know, that is important to me? And so I think the student is the opportunity, first and foremost, to really develop and hone and determine what that is for yourself, even if you'll be doing it throughout the rest of your career. And the other thing that I'll say too is that with so much going on, it is always hard to pull away. But thing that I learned, and I'll tell you this very brief anecdote. When I was proposing my dissertation, I originally proposed a 3-month summer case study with Dream Defenders. And this is prior to them occupying the Capitol and a bunch of other things that happened. And the main reason I did that was because I was trying to get out. Like, I was one of 18 Black people in Tucson. And I'd moved from Harlem, and I was trying to get back to my people and get on with my life. And it was an easier, more efficient way for me to finish my degree. And one of the things that was said to me in my oral comps meeting, and actually by a quantitative scholar, and he said, look, if you're going to do ethnography, do a damn ethnography, right? Don't shortchange it, soak up and put in the time and energy, do the rigorous work. And I thought about that a lot, in part because what I realized later on is that if I didn't invest the time and energy, which ultimately ended up being 2 years of field work and another 1.5 years of writing, then one, I wouldn't have had the quality of product that I ultimately was able to present as my dissertation. But secondly, I wouldn't have made meaningful and long-lasting relationships. I just sent a former Dream Defender, he and his wife, a gift from their baby registry because they're having a baby. And this is someone I met 8 years ago who was a college sophomore, but we're in a relationship enough and have seen each other enough over the years to be a part of each other's lives in this way. And so much of that is attributed to sitting down and doing my work and not knowing that what I was doing would actually have a longer impact beyond what came out of it in terms of the product. Because again, we think about productivity as just getting the numbers out the door, adding to the CV. And the moment you're in graduate school is a very sacred time to do that. Any person that has gone through the process and become a faculty member or gone into administration will tell you, as soon as that dissertation defense is over and you start that gig, you don't even realize all the things that you're going to be doing that will pull you away from the time that you could have done deep and engaged rigorous work, especially if you do ethnography. And I think about that a lot, about how my next projects have to be different. I won't be able to just travel along the South and sleep in the basements of churches and spend all my time with young people organizing. And so I have to think about how that work looks differently. But if I hadn't done my work the first time, I would have no idea, right, the scale or the rigor that would be needed to do it well moving forward. And I think that's just a really important note to make.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great spot for us to wrap up. Thank you again so much, Dr. Davis, for joining us. It was a fantastic presentation. I think especially our graduate students got a lot out of this, as well as some of our junior faculty who are trying to figure out how to balance these things as you are doing successfully. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Our next talk is actually going to be March 3rd. There was some conflict, so we're going to have 2 talks in March, one early March, one late March. And our next speaker is going to be Dr. Rachel Watkins from American University. Keep an eye out for the flyer and more details to come. But again, thank you all for joining us. Thanks one more time, Dr. Davis, and enjoy the rest of your day and have a good weekend.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Mm-hmm.